Hello, America. My name is Dylan John, and you are listening to Nature and the Nation. For today's episode, I would like to read and discuss the Discourse on the Origin of Inequality by Jean-Jacques Rousseau. This book is from 1755, so this is from clearly a while back. This is in the midst of the Enlightenment, although Rousseau has been considered to be sort of the beginning of the counter-Enlightenment. He criticized some of the ideas of the Enlightenment while embracing some others. Some people consider him part of the Enlightenment, some people don't. He wound up in some significant disagreement with other figures who are considered Enlightenment thinkers, such as Voltaire and others. The Enlightenment was in large part a rejection of many of the traditions of the past and an attempt to kind of apply a critique to everything and make everything answer to a rational inquiry. And I think Rousseau pushed back on that a little bit. He kind of said, that the process of civilization has been not entirely beneficial. It's had its benefits for sure, but Rousseau criticizes civilization as such, and that kind of went against some of the ideas of some of the other major Enlightenment thinkers. So Rousseau had written an essay in 1750, published in 1750, I believe, and it won a contest. And it was a contest to write an essay in response to the question, has art and science and technology and civilization been of benefit to, I'm just kind of paraphrasing here, but has been of benefit to humankind? And his answer was no, it hasn't. And he wrote the Discourse on the Arts and Sciences as a response to that question, won the prize, and that kind of really started his literary career when he won that prize. And so then he followed it up 5 years later with this one, the Discourse on the Origin of Inequality, which was also submitted to win a prize, didn't win the prize, but was very successful nonetheless. That's the one, that second essay is the one that I want to look at today. And in this essay, he's, again, talking about civilization as a sort of corrupting force. And he paints a picture of natural man, a sort of pre-civilization man. A lot of people attribute the concept of the noble savage as like originating with Rousseau and his natural man, his kind of glorification of the natural man, of the pre-civilized man. And I think that there's probably a lot of truth to that. So along those lines, I've got a few sections here I want to read. Like all my episodes, I'll read a couple of sections out of the book and then provide some comments. I'm probably not going to provide a tremendous amount of comments on this. I'm not really an expert on Rousseau. I do find him interesting, his approach interesting, his innovativeness interesting. There are a lot of things in literature, the autobiography, ways of writing, approaches to society. I mean, the birth of Romanticism. There's a lot that can be traced back to Rousseau. Sometimes we look at stuff like this nowadays and it doesn't seem as remarkable because we're so used to it. But we have to keep in mind sometimes how remarkable certain things were at the time when they weren't as common as they are now. I want to read here a little bit where he talks about natural man. He also talks a little bit about society in here. This is divided between the first part and the second part. The second part talks a lot about society. And I really want to read mostly from the first part. I got a little bit from the second part that I want to read. The first part, he really describes natural man. And the second part, he describes the fall of natural man into his modern state, where he starts getting more into political theory in that section. This book that I'm reading from also includes The Social Contract in it, which is really a separate book. These are just published together. I'm not going to get into The Social Contract. I want to talk about Rousseau's political beliefs at a different time in a different episode. But I am actually going to jump to the introduction, which is written not by Rousseau, but the introduction in this book is written by Lester Crocker. And he talks a bit about this book and provides a few of the criticisms that Rousseau has faced. Actually, the introduction here by Lester Crocker really is fairly critical, more critical of Rousseau than I would have expected from an introduction to his book like this. But it's interesting because it presents a lot of the critiques, because Rousseau is pretty heavily critiqued, especially on the right, as being sort of the father of postmodernism, in the extent that postmodernism is sort of one version of the counter-enlightenment. There's a counter-enlightenment that's more traditionalist Catholic counter-enlightenment, and then there's a more radical counter-enlightenment that is criticizing the Enlightenment not so much from pre-Enlightenment position, but from a post-Enlightenment position that says, the Enlightenment was bad maybe in some certain ways, but it's kind of bad in many of the same certain ways that things have always been bad. And Rousseau does that a bit here. So he's criticizing modernity from a pre-modern position, but he is not stepping back to like the 16th, 15th, 14th century, no, he's looking way back. He's starting way back at a pre-civilizational period. And so in some sense, it's almost postmodern, because the pre-modern that he draws from is so far back that it can be considered a sort of critique of all of Western civilization and not just a critique of modernity. And so from that perspective, and Rousseau says, we can't really go back. We can't go back to that pre-modern state. We have to learn to live with our current situation. How do we do that? And so in that sense, it is kind of postmodern. But I think that as conservatives, we can read Rousseau with an appreciative eye and understand some of his critiques of modernity that we can incorporate into our own critiques of modernity. I think Rousseau gets a number of things correct. And we ought to be open-minded when we read Rousseau, not taking everything he says as gospel, but finding some useful components in it, absolutely. So anyway, here I'm going to jump in and read this section where he says, quote, "The earth, left to its own natural fertility, and covered with immense woods that no hatchet ever disfigured, offers at every step food and shelter to every species of animals. Men, dispersed among them, observe and imitate their industry, and thus rise as high as the instinct of beasts. With this advantage, that whereas every species of beast is confined to one particular instinct, man, who perhaps has not any that particularly belongs to him, appropriates to himself those of all the other animals, and lives equally upon most of the different foods, which they only divide among themselves, a circumstance which qualifies him to find his subsistence more easily than any of them. Accustomed from their infancy to the inclemency of the weather, and to the rigor of the different seasons, inured to fatigue and obliged to defend, naked and without arms, their life and their prey, against the other wild inhabitants of the forest, or at least to avoid their fury by flight, men acquire a robust and almost unalterable constitution. The children, bringing with them into the world the excellent constitution of their parents, and strengthening it by the same exercises that first produced it, attain by this means all the vigor that the human frame is capable of. Nature treats them exactly in the same manner that Sparta treated the children of her citizens. Those who come well formed into the world she renders strong and robust, and destroys all the rest, differing in this respect from our societies, in which the state, by permitting children to become burdensome to their parents, murders them without distinction in the wombs of their mothers. The body, being the only instrument that savage man is acquainted with, he employs it to different uses, of which ours, for want of practice, are incapable, and we may thank our industry for the loss of that strength and agility which necessity obliges him to acquire. Had he a hatchet, would his hand so easily snap off from an oak so stout a branch? Had he a sling, would he hurl a stone so great a distance? Had he a ladder, would he climb so nimbly up a tree? Had he a horse, would he run with such swiftness? Give civilized man but time to gather about him all his machines, and no doubt he will outmatch the savage. But if you have a mind to see a contest still more unequal, place them naked and unarmed, one opposite to the other, and you will soon discover the advantage there is in perpetually having all our forces constantly at our disposal, in being constantly prepared against all events, and in always carrying ourselves, as it were, whole and entire about us. End quote. Okay, so there are a couple points in here that stood out to me that I want to draw your attention to. Just a couple of lines that I liked, where he says, one of them is, he says, nature treats them exactly in the same manner, meaning savage man. He says, nature treats them exactly in the same manner that Sparta treated the children of her citizens. Those who come well formed into the world, she renders strong and robust and destroys all the rest. It's almost a natural selection he's talking about, although this is clearly over 100 years before Darwin. But there's a hint of natural selection that people who come well formed into the world fit. Some people who are capable and strong are rendered strong and robust, strengthened by the trials that they endure, which is how the human body works, is strengthened by trial and tribulation. Obviously, outside injury, but we become stronger when we work. We become healthier when we work hard. We have stronger immune systems when we're exposed to the world. So nature eliminates those that are not strong enough and strengthens the rest, which is an interesting way of looking at that. But then he says, this other section here, the body being the only instrument that savage man is acquainted with, he employs it to different uses, of which ours, for want of practice, are incapable, and we may thank our industry for the loss of that strength and agility, which necessity obliges him to acquire. And then he goes on, but his point here is that industry has, he says we can thank our industry for the loss of the strength and agility, the various things that we don't have to do physically. We just have machines that will do it for us. We have devices and technology of various types that do these things for us. We don't have to know our way around anywhere anymore now that we've got maps on our phone that tell us where to go every step of the way. It's hard to even imagine when you're out and about in unfamiliar territory what you would even do if you didn't have that map on your phone constantly everywhere you go, like always right there to help you out. We have lost our capacity to keep information when we know that we can just pull it up at a moment's notice. We don't see any reason to store it in our brains, and we kind of have a natural tendency to seek the easiest route because we're used to a world that's really challenging and difficult. And as the world becomes really easy, it almost becomes dangerous to take that easiest route. We have to constantly challenge ourselves to replace the challenges that nature provides that we have found a way out of. And in order to prevent ourselves from becoming weak, we have to find new challenges to engage in to maintain our strength. And that's what he's talking about, how we've lost all of these abilities thanks to technology. And he goes on when he's talking about how, the savage, would he be as fast running if he had a horse? His point, would he be as good with maps if he had a Google map at his disposal all the time? Would he be, if he had an axe, would he be able to snap the branch off the tree with his bare hands? Probably not. Technology makes us weaker. In this section here, he talks about the innocence of natural man, where he says, quote, "Let moralists say what they will. The human understanding is greatly indebted to the passions, which on their side are likewise universally allowed to be greatly indebted to the human understanding. It is by the activity of our passions that our reason improves. We covet knowledge merely because we covet enjoyment, and it is impossible to conceive why a man, exempt from fears and desires, should take the trouble to reason. The passions, in their turn, owe their origin to our needs, and their increase to our progress in science, for we cannot desire or fear anything but in consequence of the ideas we have of it, or of the simple impulses of nature, and savage man, destitute of every species of knowledge, experiences no passions but these of this last kind. His desires never extend beyond his physical wants. He knows no goods but food, a female, and rest. He fears no evils but pain and hunger. I say pain and not death, for no animal, merely as such, will ever know what it is to die, and the knowledge of death and of its terrors is one of the first acquisitions made by man in consequence of his deviating from the animal state. I could easily, were it necessary, cite facts in support of this opinion, and show that the progress of the mind has everywhere kept pace exactly with the wants to which nature has left the inhabitants exposed, or to which circumstances has subjected them, and consequently to the passions, which inclined them to provide for these wants. I could exhibit in Egypt the arts starting up and extending themselves with the inundations of the Nile. I could pursue them in their progress among the Greeks, where they could be seen to bud, grow, and rise to the heavens in the midst of the sands and rocks of Attica, without being able to take root on the fertile banks of the Europus. I would observe that, in general, the inhabitants of the north are more industrious than those of the south, because they can less do without industry, as if nature thus meant to make all things equal, by giving to the mind that fertility she has denied to the soil. But leaving aside the uncertain testimony of history, who does not perceive that everything seems to remove from savage man the temptation and the means of altering his condition? His imagination paints nothing to him, his heart asks nothing from him. His moderate wants are so easily supplied with what he everywhere finds ready to his hand, and he stands at such a distance from the degree of knowledge requisite to covet more, that he can neither have foresight nor curiosity. The spectacle of nature, by growing quite familiar to him, becomes at last equally indifferent. It is constantly the same order, constantly the same revolutions. He has not sense enough to feel surprise at the sight of the greatest wonders, and it is not in his mind that we must look for that philosophy, which man must have known how to observe once what he has every day seen. His soul, which nothing disturbs, gives itself up entirely to the consciousness of its present existence, without any thought of even the nearest futurity, and his projects, equally confined with his views, scarce extend to the end of the day. End quote. Okay, so he's got this vision of natural man where he basically says, people's activities are all guided by their passions, which are guided by their needs, and he talks a bit about needs and the way that people's passions and fears and desires and needs are all expanded by technology, and he creates this image of natural man able to kind of reach out and grab a piece of fruit off a tree whenever he wants, like he's got everything right at his disposal, and so therefore he doesn't really have any needs, he doesn't really have any passions, he doesn't really have any wants or desires or impulses. He has nothing is unsettling him, and he's totally lost and concerned entirely with the present moment, and that's it. There's no need for foresight because there's no, so it's this like extreme level of innocence that he creates as the image of natural man, and then this innocence, slowly becomes corrupted through various means. And so here he begins to talk about the corruption of society, and in this section he says, quote, "We may infer from the little care which nature has taken to bring men together by mutual wants, and make the use of speech easy to them, how little she has done towards making them sociable, and how little she has contributed to anything which they themselves have done to become so. In fact, it is impossible to conceive why, in this primitive state, one man should have more occasion for the assistance of another than one monkey or one wolf for that of another animal of the same species. Or supposing that he had, what motive could induce another to assist him? Or even if he did so, how he who wanted assistance and he from whom it was wanted could agree upon the conditions. I know we are continually told that in this state man would have been the most wretched of all creatures. And if it is true, as I fancy I have proved it, that he must have continued many ages without either the desire or the opportunity of emerging from such a state, their assertion could only serve to justify a charge against nature, and not any against the being which nature had thus constituted. But if I thoroughly understand this term wretched, it is a word that either has no meaning or signifies nothing but a privation attended with pain, and a suffering state of body or soul. Now I would fain know what kind of misery can be that of a free being whose heart enjoys perfect peace and body perfect health, and which is most likely to become insupportable to those who enjoy it, a civil or a natural life. In civil life, we can scarcely meet a person who does not complain of his existence. Many even throw away as much of it as they can, and the united force of divine and human laws can hardly put a stop to this disorder. Was ever any free savage known to have been so much tempted to complain of life and do away with himself? Let us therefore judge with less pride on which side real misery is to be placed. Nothing, on the contrary, would have been so unhappy as savage man, dazzled by flashes of knowledge, racked by passions, and reasoning about a state different from that in which he saw himself placed. It was in consequence of a very wise providence that the faculties which he potentially enjoyed were not to develop themselves except in proportion as there offered occasion to exercise them, lest they should be superfluous or troublesome to him when he did not yet want them, or tardy and useless when he did. He had, in his instinct alone, everything requisite to live in a state of nature. In his cultivated reason, he has barely what is necessary to live in a state of society. It appears at first sight that, as there was no kind of moral relations between men in this state, nor any known duties, they could not be either good or bad, and had neither vices nor virtues, unless we take those words in a physical sense and call vices in the individual the qualities which may prove detrimental to his own preservation, and virtues those which may contribute to it, in which case we should be obliged to consider him as most virtuous who made least resistance against the simple impulses of nature. But without deviating from the usual meaning of these terms, it is proper to suspend the judgment we might form of such a situation and be on our guard against prejudice until, balance in hand, we have examined whether there are more virtues or vices among civilized men, or whether their virtues do them more good than their vices do them harm, or whether the improvement of their understanding is sufficient compensation for the mischief they do to each other, in proportion as they become better informed of the good they ought to do, or whether, on the whole, they would not be much happier in a condition where they had nothing to fear or to hope from each other than to have submitted to universal dependence, and to have obliged themselves to depend for everything upon those who do not think themselves obliged to give them anything. But above all things, let us beware of concluding with Hobbes that man, as having no idea of goodness, must be naturally bad, that he is vicious because he does not know what virtue is, that he always refuses to do any service to those of his own species because he believes that none is due to them, that in virtue of that right which he justly claims to everything he wants, he foolishly looks upon himself as proprietor of the whole universe. Hobbes very plainly saw the flaws in all the modern definitions of natural right, but the consequences, which he draws from his own definition, show that the sense in which he understands it is equally false. This author, to argue from his own principles, should say that the state of nature, being that in which the care of our own preservation interferes least with the preservation of others, was consequently the most favorable to peace, and the most suitable to mankind, whereas he advances the reverse, in consequence of his having injudiciously included in that care which savage man takes of his preservation the satisfaction of numberless passions, which are the work of society and have made laws necessary. A bad man, says he, is a robust child, but this is not proving that savage man is a robust child, and though we were to grant that he was, what could this philosopher infer from such a concession? That if this man, when robust, depended on others as much as when feeble, there is no excess that he would not be guilty of. He would make nothing of striking his mother when she delayed ever so little to give him the breast. He would claw and bite and strangle without remorse the first of his youngest brothers that ever so accidentally jostled or otherwise disturbed him. But these are two contradictory suppositions in the state of nature, to be robust and dependent. Man is weak when dependent, and his own master when he grows robust. End quote. Okay, so that section is can be kind of challenging, but he's really calling out Hobbes, actually, who's claiming that people are in this sort of a state of conflict. In Hobbes's theory, people are in this natural state of conflict. You know, you've heard of, the war of all against all and nasty, short, brutish, whatever. You've heard of Hobbes. Well, he's arguing against Hobbes's position here by saying that, let's see, there's a few points I wanted to point to. He says, quote, "We are continually told that in this state man would have been the most wretched of all creatures," meaning the state of nature. "And if it is true, as I fancy I have proved it, that he must have continued many ages without either the desire or the opportunity of emerging from such a state, their assertion could only serve to justify a charge against nature." End quote. So he's saying that it's said that, referring to Hobbes, that it's said that natural man in this state of nature is in a wretched state. And he says, well, if natural man is in complete, accord with nature, and they stayed that way for untold ages with no real desire or reason to leave the state of nature, then if it was wretched, then that's just a condemnation of nature itself as being wretched, which I think is actually a really strong point. Is nature itself a wretched thing for us to have emerged out of wretchedness? And the other part that drew my attention when he says, as there was no kind of moral relations between men in this state. So the state of nature has no moral type of interactions between people, nor any duties. They could not be either good or bad, and had neither vices nor virtues. He says it appears at first sight that as there was no kind of moral relations, they were neither good nor bad. They had neither vices nor virtues, since they didn't have any aspect of morality to their relationships with one another. He's almost postulating like a pre-moral, Garden of Eden type of scenario before morality. He says, unless we take those words in a physical sense and call vices in the individual qualities which may prove detrimental to his own preservation, anything he does that causes him less likely to survive, and virtues, those which may contribute to it, in which case we should be obliged to consider him as most virtuous, who made least resistance against the simple impulses of nature. So, if we were to consider virtue and vice in terms of virtue being what made somebody more fit for survival, and vice being something that made someone less fit for survival, in such a case, someone who gives in most thoroughly to the impulses of nature becomes most fit for survival, since all of the impulses of nature are honed through untold era and untold millennia of natural selection. The fittest individual is the one who lives most in accord with nature, who gives, he says, in which case we should be obliged to consider him as most virtuous, who made least resistance against the simple impulses of nature. But without deviating from the usual meaning of these terms, it is proper to suspend the judgment, etc., etc., etc. So that's an interesting way, because I think that when you really start digging into what virtue and vice actually are, you start running into this very concept. But it's not just on the individual level. It's things that contribute to the well-being of the group. Vices contribute instability to the group. They contribute weaknesses, fractures. And virtues contribute group unity, unification, and strengthening. So moving on from there to the next section where he starts to talk about natural empathy. And I think this is an important part, where he says, quote, "There is, besides, another principle that has escaped Hobbes, and which, having been given to man to moderate, on certain occasions, the ferocity of self-love, or the desire of self-preservation previous to the appearance of that love, tempers the ardor with which he naturally pursues his private welfare, by an innate abhorrence to see beings suffer that resemble him. I shall not surely be contradicted in granting to man the only natural virtue, which the most passionate detractor of human virtues could not deny him. I mean that of pity. A disposition suitable to creatures weak as we are and liable to so many evils, a virtue so much the more universal, and withal useful to man as it takes place in him before all manner of reflection, and so natural that the beasts themselves sometimes give evident signs of it. Not to speak of the tenderness of mothers for their young, and of the dangers they face to screen them from danger, with what reluctance are horses known to trample upon living bodies. One animal never passes unmoved by the dead carcass of another animal of the same species. There are even some who bestow a kind of sepulture upon their dead fellows, and the mournful lowings of cattle on their entering the slaughterhouse publish the impression made upon them by the horrible spectacle they are struck with. It is with pleasure that we see the author of the fable of the bees forced to acknowledge man a compassionate and sensitive being, and lay aside, in the example he offers to confirm it, his cold and subtle style. To place before us the pathetic picture of a man who, with his hands tied up, is obliged to behold a beast of prey tear a child from the arms of his mother, and then with his teeth grind the tender limbs, and with his claws rend the throbbing entrails of the innocent victim. What horrible emotions must not such a spectator experience at the sight of an event which does not personally concern him? What anguish must he not suffer at his not being able to assist the fainting mother or the expiring infant? Such is the pure impulse of nature, anterior to all manner of reflection. Such is the force of natural pity, which the most dissolute manners have as yet found it so difficult to extinguish, since we every day see in our theatrical representations those men sympathize with the unfortunate and weep at their sufferings, who, if in the tyrant's place, would aggravate the torments of their enemies. Mandeville was aware that men, in spite of all their morality, would never have been better than monsters if nature had not given them pity to assist reason. But he did not perceive that from this quality alone flow all the social virtues, which he would dispute mankind the possession of. In fact, what is generosity, what clemency, what humanity, but pity applied to the weak, to the guilty, or to the human species in general? Even benevolence and friendship, if we judge right, will appear the effects of a constant pity, fixed upon a particular object. For to wish that person may not suffer, what is it but to wish that he may be happy? Though it were true that commiseration is no more than a sentiment, which puts us in the place of him who suffers, a sentiment obscure but active in the savage, developed but dormant in civilized man, how could this notion affect the truth of what I advance but to make it more evident? In fact, commiseration must be so much the more energetic, the more intimately the animal that beholds any kind of distress identifies himself with the animal that labors under it. Now it is evident that this identification must have been infinitely more perfect in the state of nature than in the state of reason. It is reason that engenders self-love and reflection that strengthens it. It is reason that makes man shrink into himself. It is reason that makes him keep aloof from everything that can trouble or afflict him. It is philosophy that destroys his connections with other men. It is in consequence of her dictates that he mutters to himself at the sight of another in distress, "You may perish for aught I care, I am safe." nothing less than those evils which threaten the whole community can disturb the calm sleep of the philosopher and force him from his bed. One man may with impunity murder another under his windows. He has nothing to do but clap his hands to his ears, argue a little with himself to hinder nature that startles within him from identifying him with the unhappy sufferer. Savage man lacks that admirable talent, and for want of wisdom and reason is always ready foolishly to obey the first whispers of humanity. In riots and street brawls, the populace flock together. The prudent man sneaks off. It is the dregs of the people, the market women, that part the combatants and hinder gentle folks from cutting one another's throats. It is therefore certain that pity is a natural sentiment, which, by moderating in every individual the activity of self-love, contributes to the mutual preservation of the whole species. It is this pity which hurries us without reflection to the assistance of those we see in distress. It is this pity which, in a state of nature, takes the place of laws, manners, virtue, with this advantage, that no one is tempted to disobey her gentle voice. It is this pity which will always hinder a robust savage from plundering a feeble child or infirm old man of the subsistence they have acquired with pain and difficulty, if he has but the least prospect of providing for himself by any other means. It is this pity which, instead of that sublime maxim of rational justice, do to others as you would have others do to you, inspires all men with that other maxim of natural goodness, a great deal less perfect, but perhaps more useful. Do good to yourself, with as little prejudice as you can to others. It is, in a word, in this natural sentiment, rather than in fine-spun arguments, that we must look for the cause of that reluctance which every man would experience to do evil, even independently of the maxims of education. Though it may be the peculiar happiness of Socrates and other geniuses of his stamp to reason themselves into virtue, the human species would long ago have ceased to exist had it depended entirely for its preservation on the reasonings of the individuals that compose it. End quote. Okay, so slightly longer section on natural empathy. He's talking about pity, and he basically says that pity is the singular natural virtue that natural man, aside from vitality, but as far as interpersonal, like sentiment, people have this sort of natural pity or natural aversion to seeing other people come to harm. And it's not the sort of thing that you need to have explained to you, and the rational philosophers attempt to turn this natural sentiment of natural pity into some sort of a logical framework, kind of a rationalistic, like, do unto others as you would have them do unto you, whereas you have to think this thing through ahead of time to how you want them to treat you, and then you shape your treatment to become something that you've rationally discerned from how you would prefer yourself to be treated. There's a sort of rationalism in there, whereas the other, he talks about another moral code where he says, in fact, I'll read this section right here. He says, quote, "It is this pity which, instead of that sublime maxim of rational justice, do to others as you would have others do to you, inspires all men with that other maxim of natural goodness, a great deal less perfect, but perhaps more useful. Do good to yourself with as little prejudice as you can to others." It is, in a word, in this natural sentiment, rather than in fine-spun arguments, that we must look for the cause of that reluctance which every man would experience to do evil. So in the sense that people have a natural reluctance to want to commit evil acts, they're basically following the natural maxim of natural goodness, more or less, which is to do good to themselves with as little harm to others as possible. This is how people live. We mostly just act in our own best interest, to our own benefit, while also simultaneously trying to do that while doing as little harm to other people as possible. as we ultimately feel comfortable with, I suppose, as little as would cause our natural sentiment of pity to revolt against us. And he also talks about how everything else sort of develops out of that natural pity, where he says, quote, "What is generosity, what clemency, what humanity, but pity applied to the weak, to the guilty, or to the human species in general? Even benevolence and friendship, if we judge right, will appear the effects of a constant pity fixed upon a particular object." So he's almost also talking along the same lines of William James in the psychology book there, where he talks about all of the instincts that people have and that drives them to their various activities. And Rousseau is talking about how these various, what we sort of see as these altruistic virtues of clemency and benevolence and friendship and humanity and generosity, that these are all just kind of deviations from that natural pity. So, moving on from there, he starts to begin. This is where the second part begins, and he starts to talk about property. So, from the very beginning of the second part, he says, quote, "The first man who, after enclosing a piece of ground, took it into his head to say, 'This is mine,' and found people simple enough to believe him, was the real founder of civil society. How many crimes, how many wars, how many murders, how many misfortunes and horrors would that man have saved the human race, who, pulling up the stakes or filling up the ditches, should have cried to his fellows, 'Beware of listening to this impostor! You are lost if you forget that the fruits of the earth belong equally to us all, and the earth itself to nobody.' But it is highly probable that these things had by then already come to such a pass that they could not continue much longer as they were. For as this idea of property depends on several prior ideas, which could only spring up gradually one after another, it was not formed all at once in the human mind. Men must have made considerable progress. They must have acquired a great stock of industry and knowledge, and transmitted and increased it from age to age, before they could arrive at this last point of the state of nature. Let us therefore take up things at an earlier stage, and collect into one point of view, and in their most natural order, the slow succession of events and discoveries. Man's first feeling was that of his existence, his first care for that of preserving it. The productions of the earth yielded him all the assistance he required. Instinct prompted him to make use of them. Hunger and other appetites made him at different times experience different modes of existence. One of these excited him to perpetuate his species, and this blind propensity, quite void of anything like pure love or affection, produced nothing but an act that was merely animal. Their need once gratified, the sexes took no further notice of each other, and even the child was nothing to his mother the moment he could do without her. Such was the condition of infant man. Such was the life of an animal, confined at first to pure sensations, and so far from harboring any thought of forcing her gifts from nature, that he scarcely availed himself of those which she offered to him of her own accord. But difficulties soon arose, and there was a necessity for learning how to surmount them, the height of some trees which prevented his reaching their fruits, the competition of other animals equally fond of the same fruits, the fierceness of many that even aimed at his life. These were so many circumstances which obliged him to apply to bodily exercise. There was a necessity for becoming active, swift-footed, and sturdy in battle. The natural arms, which are stones and the branches of trees, soon offered themselves to his reach. He learned to surmount the obstacles of nature, to fight when necessary with other animals, to fight for his subsistence even with other men, or indemnify himself for the loss of whatever he found himself obliged to yield to a stronger. In proportion as the human species grew more numerous and extended itself, its difficulties likewise multiplied and increased. The difference of soils, climates, and seasons succeeded in forcing them to introduce some difference in their way of living. Bad harvests, long and severe winters, and scorching summers, which parched up all the fruits of the earth, required a new resourcefulness and activity. On the seashore and the banks of rivers, they invented the line and the hook, and became fishermen and fish-eaters. In the forests, they made themselves bows and arrows, and became huntsmen and warriors. In the cold countries, they covered themselves with the skins of the beasts they had killed. Thunder, a volcano, or some happy accident made them acquainted with fire. A new resource against the rigors of winter. They discovered the method of preserving this element, then that of reproducing it, and lastly, the way of preparing with it the flesh of animals, which heretofore they had devoured raw." End quote. So he starts talking about property, but he says there's a lot of previous steps before we get right up to property. There were a lot of technological developments. There were social developments. There was development of language, which alone was a very long, slow process before the idea of property came about. Now, how accurate is he about all that? Actually, not really, probably as accurate as he thinks he is. And I'll get into some of the criticisms of Rousseau in just a moment, where they talk about that a little bit in the introduction. But yeah, it's not. I mean, that's not an exact description of the rise of the human species, but keep in mind this is long before Darwin. This is 1755. Archaeology and anthropology are just beginning to be a thing. So there's a lot that he doesn't know, but he also makes a few interesting points. There are a few parts here I wanted to point out. The first is the way that he opens up the entire second part of the book, where he says, quote, "The first man who, after enclosing a piece of ground, took it into his head to say, 'This is mine,' and found people simple enough to believe him, was the real founder of civil society." So he really traces a lot back to property, and kind of as the creator of, the book is The Discourse and the Origin of Inequality. So property really is the origin of inequality in Rousseau's mind. So you have to wonder to what degree Rousseau is anticipating the socialists who would follow soon in his footsteps. The other part that I wanted to point to is where he says, quote, "In proportion as the human species grew more numerous and extended itself, its difficulties likewise multiplied and increased." And so here he talks a bit about population, which is a topic that I want to get into at some point more deeply, maybe down the road. But the idea that as population is increasing, they're spreading a crowd out into different areas, and they're encountering challenges. And so there's this kind of struggle between, you can't just have this never-ending expanding population without resources growing scarce, fertile soil growing scarce, conflict over territory, conflict over resources, and things of that nature. That's really bound up in population. And Malthus wrote not terribly long after Rousseau and goes into much greater detail about this. And that's something that I want to address when I talk about population. But I've got a few more books between now and then. But I think that the population question is important. So let me jump forward here to he goes a little bit further down the road of property. Like that section there ended with okay, they've got basic farming equipment and basic technology, but nothing really advanced. They're fishermen, hooks and lines, bows and arrows, huntsmen and warriors, and they've discovered fire and they're cooking food, and none of that really sounds too bad. It sounds like there's kind of a nice spot you could settle in right there and have a pretty happy existence. But obviously, the quest for property grows, and so this next section, he develops his line of thought a little further. He says, quote, "Everything now begins to wear a new aspect. Those who heretofore wandered through the woods, by taking to a more settled way of life, gradually flock together, coalesce into several separate bodies, and, at length, form in every country a distinct nation, united in character and manners, not by any laws or regulations, but by the same way of life, and alimentation and the common influence of the climate. Living permanently near each other, could not fail eventually to create some connection between different families. The transient commerce required by nature soon produced, among the youth of both sexes living in neighboring huts, another kind of commerce, which, besides being not less agreeable, is rendered more durable by mutual association. Men begin to consider different objects and to make comparisons. They imperceptibly acquire ideas of merit and beauty, and these soon give rise to feelings of preference. By seeing each other often, they contract a habit, which makes it painful to not see each other always. Tender and agreeable sentiments steal into the soul and are by the smallest opposition wound up into the most impetuous fury. Jealousy kindles with love, discord triumphs, and the gentlest of passions requires sacrifices of human blood to appease it. In proportion as ideas and feelings succeed each other, and the head and the heart become active, men continue to shake off their original wildness, and their connections become more intimate and extensive. They now begin to assemble round a great tree, singing and dancing. The genuine offspring of love and leisure became the amusement, or rather the occupation, of the men and women free from care, thus gathered together. Everyone began to notice the rest, and wished to be noticed himself, and public esteem acquired a value. He who sang or danced best, the handsomest, the strongest, the most dexterous, or the most eloquent, came to be the most respected. This was the first step toward inequality, and at the same time toward vice. From these first distinctions there rose, on one side, vanity and contempt, and on the other, envy and shame. And the fermentation raised by these new leavens at length produced combinations fatal to happiness and innocence. Men no sooner began to set a value upon each other, and know what esteem was, than each laid claim to it, and it was no longer safe for any man to refuse it to another. Hence the first duties of politeness, even among savages, and hence every voluntary injury became an affront, as besides the hurt which resulted from it, as an injury, the offended party was sure to find it in a contempt for his person, often more intolerable than the hurt itself. It is thus that every man, punishing the contempt expressed for him by others in proportion to the value he set upon himself, the effects of revenge became terrible, and men learned to be sanguinary and cruel. Such precisely was the degree attained by most of the savage nations with whom we are acquainted, and it is for want of sufficiently distinguishing ideas, and observing at how great a distance these people were from the first state of nature, that so many authors have hastily concluded that man is naturally cruel, and requires a civil government to make him more gentle, whereas nothing is more gentle than he in his primitive state. When placed by nature at an equal distance from the stupidity of brutes and the pernicious enlightenment of civilized man, and confined equally by instinct and reason to providing against the harm which threatens him, he is withheld by natural compassion from doing any injury to others, so far from being led even to return that which he has received. For according to the axiom of wise Locke, where there is no property, there can be no injury. But we must take notice that the society now formed, and the relations now established among men, required in them qualities different from those which they derived from their primitive constitution. That as a sense of morality began to insinuate itself into human actions, and every man before the enacting of the laws was the only judge and avenger of the injuries he had received, that goodness of heart suitable to the pure state of nature by no means was suitable for the new society. That it was necessary punishments should become severer in the same proportion that the opportunities of offending became more frequent, and the dread of vengeance adds strength to the too weak curb of the law. Thus, though men had become less patient, and natural compassion had already suffered some alteration, this period of the development of the human faculties, holding a just mean between the indolence of the primitive state and the petulant activity of egoism, must have been the happiest and most durable epoch. The more we reflect on this state, the more convinced we shall be that it was the least subject to any revolutions, the best for man, and that nothing could have drawn him out of it but some fatal accident, which for the common good should never have happened. The example of savages, most of whom have been found in this condition, seems to confirm that mankind was formed ever to remain in it, that this condition is the real youth of the world, and that all ulterior improvements have been so many steps, in appearance, toward the perfection of individuals, but in fact, toward the decrepitness of the species. As long as men remained satisfied with their rustic huts, as long as they were content with clothes made of the skin of animals, sewn with thorns and fish bones, as long as they continued to consider feathers and shells as sufficient ornaments, and to paint their bodies different colors, to improve or ornament their bows and arrows, to fashion with sharp-edged stones some little fishing boats or clumsy instruments of music, in a word, as long as they undertook such works only as a single person could finish, and stuck to such arts as did not require the joint endeavors of several hands, they lived free, healthy, honest, and happy, as much as their nature would admit, and continued to enjoy with each other all the pleasures of an independent intercourse. But from the moment one man began to stand in need of another's assistance, from the moment it appeared an advantage for one man to possess enough provisions for two, equality vanished, property was introduced, labor became necessary, and boundless forests became smiling fields which had to be watered with human sweat, and in which slavery and misery were soon seen to sprout out and grow with the harvests. End quote. So he talks here about how people begin to begin to flock together. They begin to join together through their proximity. And he talks about them gathering together, forming little villages, dancing around the tree, and having relationships with one another, and jealousies, and the sorts of things that crop up with that, the sort of ideas of who dances best, who's the strongest, who's this, who's that. The idea of merit and value comes into the world. People valuing certain things, wanting to be seen a certain way by other people, demanding a certain amount of respect from people, laws of behavior, politeness, the sort of things. This seems like a little bit further along the path, although he isn't actually talking about property yet, but he's still talking about the idea of inequality, the idea of jealousy, the idea of vanity, revenge, conflicts between people that rise up out of their proximity to one another. And so none of it seems all that particularly unnatural to me. Now, again, I have a number of criticisms of things. I haven't really gotten into the criticisms much. I want to wait till I get to the introduction to talk about that a little bit. But some of the things that he describes here as being like some of the beginnings of inequality seem pretty natural phenomena to me. But then again, I think inequality itself is a pretty natural phenomenon. So the idea that there was inequality only with the arrival of property, I'm not so sure. But I guess it depends on how you define inequality. But there are a few points here that I want to draw your attention to that I thought were noteworthy. Here, where he's talking about people gathered and singing and dancing around the tree. He says, everyone began to notice the rest, and wished to be noticed himself, and public esteem acquired a value. He who sang or danced best, the handsomest, the strongest, the most dexterous, or the most eloquent, came to be the most respected. This was the first step toward inequality, and at the same time toward vice. From these first distinctions there arose on one side vanity and contempt, on the other envy and shame, and the fermentation raised by these new leavens at length produced combinations fatal to happiness and innocence. That was just reiterating what I had just said. But the other section that I want to point out is where he says, quote, nothing is more gentle than he in his primitive state, when placed by nature at an equal distance from the stupidity of brutes and the pernicious enlightenment of civilized man, and confined equally by instinct and reason, providing against the harm which threatens him, he is withheld by natural compassion from doing any injury to others. So that seems like really almost over the top statement about the gentleness and the innocence of this natural man. Almost over the top. But he says basically, even the later period when people have begun building things, basic things, and have begun to have senses of merit and jealousy and so forth. He says, even so, that seems like the best state. It seems like people don't ever want to leave that state. He says, it seems like the real problem started when people began to cooperate with each other to build things. He says, I'll look to this last section. He says, as long as they undertook such works only as a single person could finish, and stuck to such arts as did not require the joint endeavors of several hands, they lived free, healthy, honest, and happy, as much as their nature would admit, and continued to enjoy with each other all the pleasures of an independent intercourse. But from the moment one man began to stand in need of another's assistance, from the moment it appeared an advantage for one man to possess enough provisions for two, equality vanished, property was introduced, blah, blah, blah. But it seems to me that one person in need of another's assistance is probably something that would go back to the very earliest experiences of people. Now, he talked previously about how would animals in a pre-language state communicate with each other their needs for assistance, but in a post-language state, it should be pretty easy for one to say, hey, help me out here. I feel like that's going way back to the very beginning of, language, I guess. And the other thing that he says, from the moment it appeared an advantage for one man to possess enough provisions for two, equality vanished. But that seems like pretty fairly elementary realization for a person to realize that they have more than they need, so that if something happens, they have extra, or so that they can give some to people that they want to be their allies. I'm pretty sure like chimpanzees do that. And that really gets to some of the criticisms of this, which I'll look at right now from the introduction. So here, looking back to the introduction, Lester Crocker says, quote, "To ask how inequality came to be is to inquire how society came to be, since inequality is a social relationship. Rousseau's cardinal assumption, then, is that society came to be as an act of human will, and that it is possible to conceive of a natural man living in isolation. On this assumption, all the rest stands. If it is not historically true, Rousseau cautiously avoids the commitment to fact, though his reasoning proceeds as if his hypotheses were factual. It is at least a theoretical truth, both valid and necessary. In the drama of the establishment of civil society, the villain in the piece is property. From it grew all the inequalities and moral ills of mankind, but property itself was a rather late institution, one that came to be as a result of increasing population, the discovery of metallurgy, and the consequent division of labor. To determine how all this may have developed, Rousseau paints an unforgettable picture of man in the state of nature, and then describes the steps which led to what might be called a secular version of his fall and expulsion from the Garden of Eden. While much of Rousseau's anthropology is false, some of it is quite valid. It little matters, for it is his philosophy that is a constant provocation and challenge. What is man? What is nature? These are the ultimate questions at stake. Rousseau tries to reconstruct the logic of human development. In doing so, he posits a man who lacks qualities we would consider necessary to the human status: moral notions, language, thought, the need for others, and a continuing relationship with others. His original man is human only by virtue of his feeling of pity, his freedom, and his fatal perfectibility. Once again, the transposed myth of the fall. Historically, this natural man is completely artificial. Yet the picture has a strong appeal to our imagination, and upon it Rousseau builds his theory. It is also possible to consider Rousseau's natural man, although he never so states, as a pseudo-historical transposition of a psychological reality. This is the original nature we bring with us at birth, before the awakening of moral responses and the molding process of social patterns. Again, it might be objected that human beings have never existed and never could exist without others, nor consequently without judgments of right and wrong. This was the common 18th century opinion. But Rousseau really escapes this criticism, since the creature he paints is admittedly not human but pre-human, living in a state of animality. If we should object further that even this animal is a purely mythical construct as unreal as a faun or a phoenix, Rousseau might reply that it is a necessary hypothetical construct for his purpose, leading to valid conclusions. We must remember that Rousseau is striving to show that man, naturally good, has been corrupted and perverted by society. To demonstrate this, he must obviously find a way of revealing a man who is outside of society and prior to it. Such, then, is his artificial, natural man, natural only in the sense of a nature which is purely metaphysical, absolute, or essential. The real difficulty in Rousseau's argument is that he cannot stay on this level. To make his point, he must also consider man in an empirical nature and in a historical order. His trick is to make it seem that there is no break, that the historical man is the logical and actual development of the other, the abstract original man. In the first situation, man is good, or at least not evil. In the second, he is inevitably evil. So the conclusion becomes inescapable. Society has corrupted man. Yet is there not a basic truth in all this? Rousseau's logic and anthropology, to be sure, break down. He errs in conceiving of social relationships as external to man, as an accidental and unnecessary accretion. He is wrong in thinking that human nature can be abstracted from these relationships and considered in itself. He is right, however, in thinking that our human qualities are unfolded by social experience, that we are born with little baggage other than some basic drives, freedom from the fixity of animal instinct and perfectibility, or certain faculties which we can develop. He is right again, in large measure, in attributing to society the development of man as a moral being, a being who is moral not only in the acquisition of a particular code of ethics, but even more basically, inasmuch as he experiences spiritual love and the need for power, security, and prestige. In society, man comes to feel the insatiable restlessness of curiosity and increasing needs. In society, he inevitably knows, does, and suffers evil, as well as good. In this sense, society corrupts man, and man in society is inevitably evil. But both good and evil were already in him, as potentialities, and as he cannot exist or properly be considered philosophically without society, man, we must conclude, despite Rousseau's refusal to admit it, is necessarily evil, naturally evil. There is no lost innocence. Rousseau's own conclusion, however, is precisely a rejection of the doctrine that man is naturally evil. He eludes it not only by his concept of a pre-social natural man, but by semantic juggling or trickery. He speaks often of human nature being naturally good. Actually, all he has shown is a picture of a pre-human who is also pre-moral. This pre-human is incapable of moral goodness or virtue, which requires moral judgment and self-sacrifice, of which man is capable, he freely admits, only in society. The germs of what in society will become moral good and moral evil are both present in Rousseau's natural men. End quote. So there you see the basic criticism here is that Rousseau creates this natural man that doesn't historically, anthropologically really match up with any kind of man at any point in history. Like we're social in some form or another as far back as we're human. We're social back to a pre-human state. We're social back to an animal state fundamentally. And our proclivities for what would be considered evil behavior is not something that we acquire from society. We don't come from this pre-moral state. I mean, I suppose as we come from animals, if are animals in a pre-moral state, then I suppose an animal is in a pre-moral state. But there's some form of behavioral patterns even in animals. Maybe one other way to look at it would be to think of the natural man that Rousseau creates for us as an archetypal natural man. And I think that he mentions that a little bit in the introduction as a possible way of viewing it as a psychological phenomena, a psychological reality, rather than an actual reality. And I think there might be something to that if we think about it. A archetypally natural man, it's not going to be the sort of natural man we can aspire to or achieve. That's not the nature of archetypes. It's kind of an idealized natural man, an archetypal natural man that we can compare ourselves to and to understand ourselves better, but that we can't actually strive to become or necessarily say that we ever were. I don't know. It's hard to say that there. I mean, it's easy to say that this sort of original natural man is not naturally good. There's not a natural goodness. But as far as whether we can be traced back to a pre-moral state, we probably actually can be traced back to a pre-moral state. But so long as creatures interact with one another, they make demands on one another, and they are violent with one another if they don't follow the demands that they make. And this is in terms of dominance hierarchies, that there's a code of conduct that all the creatures in a dominance hierarchy have come to accept. And so long as they adhere to the norm that is established by the dominance hierarchy, then there's no conflict. But when a creature deviates from that dominance hierarchy, conflict arises. And to some extent, that could be considered the basic framework that morality is built out of. A code of conduct that people are expected to engage in. You would feel a creature that feels a natural inclination to adhere to the existing dominance hierarchy is a creature that is going to be more successful than a creature with a natural inclination to go against the existing dominance hierarchy. Because the existing dominance hierarchy is a power hierarchy. And going along with the existing power hierarchy is more sustainable than trying to rebel against it without the establishment of a new, superior, more functional power hierarchy, a more fit power hierarchy. Absent that, it's really self-destructive behavior. Anyway, that's Rousseau, and I've got some more Rousseau I want to come to in some future episodes. In the meantime, thanks for listening. Bye.